Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So you back in the alligator pit where it get treacherous, dangerous, and violent. So in this video, we're going to talk about some history pertaining to American domestic terrorism. So this video is going to deal with the history of American domestic terrorism. I want to dedicate this video to the young children that lost their lives in the Bowen homes daycare bombings on October the 13th, 1980. And I also want to dedicate this video to those 4 girls that blew up in that church from the bombing in Alabama. The 4 girls who died in that bombing. This video is going to be dedicated to all the innocent melanated American people throughout the South, the North, the Midwest, the Far West, the Eastern Seacoast, that just lost their lives from probably racial violence, discrimination, people being prejudiced, and predators going out looking for innocent victim people to kill. And instead of them finding somebody that will be a good adversary that they can have a real good militant battle with, they choose to prey on someone that they deem as weak or someone that can't defend themselves. So we just want to dedicate this video to all the young people that lost their lives in the last several hundred years, going all the way back to the colonial era, when you had a lot of foreigners first reach the American shores, and they started to perpetuate and participate in enslaving and denationalizing the indigenous people on the land, which are the ancestors of so-called Black Americans. So we just dedicating this to all the young people that lost their lives, those elderly people that lost their lives, and the people that just were doing their best to protect themselves, but they still may have lost their lives. All right. So we're going to deal with the example of the Bowen homes daycare bombings that happened on the west side of Atlanta. Okay, so we're going to learn about an event that happened on the west side of Atlanta in the early 80s. And we're going to go into the history of the domestic terrorist group known as the Ku Klux Klan. And we'll talk about what was going on during the American Civil War. The Reconstruction era is really when a lot of our power and a lot of the collective national, I'll say, representation that we had as so-called Black American people who are here from the land. They're not descendants of any foreigners. But that consolidation of power that it looks like we had, it started to weaken, and it was severely attacked from the mid-1800s on down. So a lot of people may wonder, well, dang, it looked like in the ancient world and even in the medieval period that so-called Black American people had power. They had power in Europe. They also had power here in the Americas, but when did they lose this power? A lot of that started to fracture in the mid to late 1800s. And one of these central core events was what we know of as the American Civil War. Now, of course, our people were not predominantly brought over from so-called Africa, but I will say this: whether you were a so-called free person, whether you were a person that had rich and wealth, whether you were middle class, whether you were somebody that was just maybe poor in poverty, or you were somebody that actually was forced into servitude, or maybe you had some form of a bad labor contract. But in the mid to late 1800s, no matter what social class you may have been in economically, if you had the physical appearance, if you had the phenotype of what we call a so-called Black American, what's called a so-called Negro, a colored, a Indian, all these various terms and labels that were put on our people, if you physically met any of those classifications, then your people were attacked economically, politically, and nationally. And this started to take place in mass in the mid to late 1800s. So no, the Civil War was not about freeing so-called Black Americans from slavery, because a lot of our people, weren't even caught up in that. A lot of our people actually even owned slaves or had people working for them. But what it was is ultimately to usher in a new form of government and power, which was called the United States, because prior to that it was America. All right. Also, when you think about the American South, when you think about the so-called Confederacy, you think about a part of the country geographically where it looks like there are landowners and people calling their own shots. They have a separation from the federal government. They have a separation from what's going on the 13 colonies. They seem to be calling their own, calling their own moves. They're not, they have a separation between church and, the state and the federal government. All right. what they eventually created in Washington, D.C., aka the 13 colonies in the Deep South. It was separate from that. The Deep South was looked at as a wild jungle of unknown territory with wild Indians. So a lot of those people from Europe that came on the 13 colonies, they didn't want to go into the Deep South because it was very, very dangerous. They knew it was wild Indian territory. But what started to happen is just as time went on, you had people that were on the 13 colonies, whether they were melanated or they may have been a Caucasian person from Europe. And they started to include themselves and intermarry into these various tribes, nations, and confederacies into the Deep South. And in the Deep South, the people were calling their own shots. They were landowners. They had their own banks. They were working together. They were living off of the land. They had trade. And they didn't need nobody for anything. They had their guns. You know what I'm saying? So that is how they were living. But in order to create the United States, that had to come to an end. So a lot of those ideological differences also played into what happened in the American Civil War. It was really to subjugate the American, what you all call rural South, which really is the indigenous South, the independent South, to put a fracture to that so everything can be under a union and can be all controlled through a central government or a central point called Washington, D.C. Okay? So so-called black Americans, you know, you have the power to be your own nation. You have the power to have your own political party. You have the power to create your own military. You have the power to create your own banks, etc. But if you do that, then a lot of the people who've been eating off of the land and have been milking the cow for the last 200 years, they won't be able to do that anymore. So you have to be threatened. Violence has to be put upon you. Fear has to be placed upon you. And this is where the domestic terrorism comes in, to run the people off of the land. So when you think about the Trail of Tears that have happened in the early 1800s under President Andrew Jackson, that was to run the people off of the land. So now the United States or any investors that are associated with the 13 colonies or associated with Europe, associated with foreigners, they can come in now and buy the land. Now they can establish their plantations and things of that nature. But the people that were already there, they already had that going on for over 1,000 years. Okay? So that's why so-called black Americans are victims of what we, know of as racism, is because you are the true American landowner. You were here before Europeans, so you have the right and the predominant primary say-so on the land. So you had to be scared out of that, and you had to be also mentally tricked out of that to think that you were from another place, and a lot of other confusion that our people have been dealing with. So we got a couple of documents we're going to read. The first one is coming from a website called Ordo Ab Cow, and this is from a author by the name of David Livingston. I've mentioned this before, but I wanted to read it again so, for you all that may have not heard the old tape, can hear it now, and we can include this into our study. Okay, so let's read. Dixieland. The Curse of Ham, the controversial rabbinical interpretation of the Bible, became the basis for the subjugation of African slaves, ultimately created an ideological divide that resulted in the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865 and persists to this day, serving as the basis for the Southern strategy. The Curse of Ham also received the support of Freemasonry, where it served to justify the exclusion of blacks. The first justification was articulated in Anderson's Constitutions of 1923, where he outlined the legends of Freemasonry as well as its regulations or charges, including the, quote, ancient landmarks. Among these landmarks was the requirement that a candidate for Freemasonry, quote, must be good and true men, free-born and of mature and discreet age, no bondmen, no women, no immoral or scandalous men, but of good report, end quote. So the first thing that we want to understand is the people that were coming over to the Americas, they were from Europe. Some of them had Middle Eastern descent. And predominantly they practiced the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and some of them even engaged in pantheism. But when it came to the slave trade, most of these people were either Catholics, Jews, or Christians. Okay? The curse of Ham comes from the Old Testament, where you have the three sons of Noah. And according to the story, the son Ham defiled his father, and there was a curse put upon Ham's son Canaan and Canaan's descendants, that they will be a servant of the other brothers. All right? Based on a lot of the Caucasian Jewish rabbis who were involved in some of these slave trade, I will say, of people that actually were from so-called Africa, they used the curse of Ham as a justification to enslave the melanated people. Because the truth is that so-called black Americans, when it comes to the biblical ethnic categories, I'll say, so-called black Americans are a Shemitic or a Semitic people. So-called black Americans are not Hamitic. Alright? But it didn't matter. They were using it to justify. Okay? So, moving on, it says that the curse of Ham also received the support of Freemasonry. Now, listen up and pay attention to Freemasonry, because Freemasonry is going to have a lot to do with the Ku Klux Klan. It's going to have a lot to do with these attacks against so-called black Americans. And it's going to also have a lot to do with why it continues to exist for so long, and you can't seem to figure out, who is in it. Let's continue. Quote, in antebellum America, according to David Goldenberg, the curse of Ham, quote, was the single greatest justification for maintaining black slavery and for keeping that social order in place for centuries, end quote. Pre-Civil War Americans regarded Southerners as a distinct people who possessed their own values and ways of life. During the 3 decades leading up to the Civil War, popular writers created a stereotype known as the, quote, plantation legend that described the South as a land of aristocratic planters, Southern belles, and devoted house slaves. This image of the South as, quote, a land of cotton where old times are not forgotten was popularized in 1859 in a song called Dixie, written by a northerner named Dan N. Emmett, probably the best known song to have come out of blackface minstrelsy. Emmett adopted the tune for a pseudo-African American spiritual in the 1870s or 1880s. Blackface performers added their own verses or altered the song. The chorus changed to, quote, I wish I was in Canaan. Now let's go from this to the top down. So this author David Goldenberg, in his book The Antebellum America, writes that the curse of Ham was the single greatest justification for maintaining black slavery and for keeping that social order in place for centuries. Now remember, so-called black Americans were not in slavery for centuries. But what was true is that through the dumb diverses, through them looking at the American indigenous people as savages because we had a different form of religion, culture, we dressed different, we looked different, they used those things as justification. Through their racism, they used this as justification. And also, let me say this now, some of these people coming from Europe are so-called black themselves. So you had so-called black Europeans, some of them, not all of them, but you had some so-called black Europeans that looked at the melanated American Indian as a savage. So this was not all Caucasian Europeans that I'm talking about here. You had so-called black Europeans looking at American Indians as savage, even though they favored each other in ethnicity. Now remember when I said that the South was seen as a distinct place? Look, it says pre-Civil War Americans regarded Southerners as a distinct people who possessed their own values and ways of life. And just like it was like that then, it's still like that now. People in the South have always seemed to be different by Northerners and by people that were on the 13 colonies, because the Deep South was a mystical, mysterious land. They weren't living in the Deep South. They weren't living inland America. A lot of them were living along the coast because they were only allowed to live on the lands that were established by charters produced by the melanated kings of Europe, but trust and believe that they had business relationships, contractual relationships, lease agreements, rental agreements with the American Indians who were living in those lands when the Europeans showed up. So when I talk about the Iroquois Confederacy, when I talk about the Powhatan, the Yamasee, the Uchi, the Mobilian, the Timucua, all these different American Indian tribes that were met by the Dutch, that were met by the French, that were met by the Spanish, that were met by the English, they had to set up business deals. They didn't just come here and take no land and set up shop like that. Are you crazy? Think about it. How you gonna come to somebody else's land and it's hundreds of thousands, it's millions of these people, and you come into a land and you don't know where you at, you don't know how to eat off of the land, you don't even know where it's safe to set up shop at. How you gonna come here and set up a civilization, and the people that are from here, you don't get their permission, and they just gonna allow you to do that? So they gonna just allow you to set up civilization even though you don't know what the hell you're doing, when they can just come and just stomp all y'all out and kill all y'all and get you up out of here real quick and overwhelm you and overpower you? You don't know where you are. The Europeans didn't know nothing about this land until the Americans showed them. So trust and believe. Yes, when it says that the pre-Civil War Americans regarded Southerners as a distinct people, these Southerners that they talking about so-called black Southerners. They talking about indigenous American people that were living in the South, and they talking about black Europeans who had come and lived in the deep South and intermarried with them and probably had been living there over 100 years. Had children, had grandchildren, and died and moved on. So these are the Southerners that they talking about. They talking about American Indians, the Uchi, the Creek, the Muskogee, the Yamasee that were living in Georgia, living in the Carolinas, been there for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, been there. They are the Southerners. And then you had black Europeans that came to the 13 colonies, but they broke off and went into the South. And they started living with the American Indian, and they were absorbed into the American Indian culture. They were absorbed into the American Indian way of life. They may have intermarried into the American Indian family. So they may have been a black European, but they've been absorbed into the melanated American community now. And they've taken on that way of life. That's how you can have so-called black Americans that are from the South, and they could have a melanated European ancestor, but that ancestor came to the South from the 13 colonies and immersed themselves in the black American community that had been in the South for thousands of years. So yes, pre-Civil War Americans regarded Southerners as a distinct people who possessed their own values and ways of life. Black people in the South always been doing stuff the way that they want to do it. And it's always been different. We talk different. We carry ourselves different. The way we cook our food is different. We hunt down here. Look at the gun laws in the South. Why y'all think the gun laws in the South are the most favorable in the country? Why do you think the Caucasian Confederacy was able to even set up shop the way they did? Because the American South, the old South, we always had our weapons and guns down here and was doing things the way we wanted to do it. That's why all the states in the South still have those gun-friendly laws, stand your ground laws, open carry state laws. This is ancient. All right. So when it goes on to say that popular writers during this time created a stereotype known as the plantation legend, that described the South as a land of aristocratic planters, Southern belles, and devoted house slaves. You know who was living the plantation legend? The black Americans who were living in the South. The black American Indian and the black American European, descendant of Europe. That's who was living the aristocratic dream. They were the aristocratic planters. How you gonna grow stuff in the South if you ain't from the South? The Europeans didn't know nothing about that. The only way a European would have learned about it is if they start hanging with somebody that was already in the South and intermarried into their family. So that's actually who was running shit. The Southern belles, those were the women of color in the South. They were the ones riding horse and carriage. You know what I'm saying? With the big fancy gowns. And a lot of them were landowners. They weren't no fucking slaves. You see what I'm saying? And when it talks about the devoted house slaves, you had people that were put in slavery that were of color, and you had Caucasian people that were put in slavery. So did you have certain groups of Caucasian people that were starting to come into prominence, and they had racist values, and they started to take over the Democratic Party? Of course, absolutely. Those are the people that became what we know of as Dixiecrats, like these people that they're talking about here. But that's not everybody in the South. You had so-called black people in the South that was running shit, and they weren't answering to nobody. But through these wars in the Civil War and Reconstruction, they started to lose power. All right, let's continue. Now it's going to get deep. In the United States, Giuseppe Mazzini, who is this gentleman you see on the screen, born 1805, died 1872. In the United States, Giuseppe Mazzini spearheaded a plan in league with the Rothschilds to foment the Civil War along the divide of the volatile issue of race. Central to this plan, reports Hager, was the Rothschild family. The Mazzini-Rothschild conspiracy devolved from Southern Jewish community networked with secret societies of the Skull and Bones, the Knights of the Golden Circle, and the Ku Klux Klan, who were inspired by the vigilantism of the Holy Vam, who advanced that cause of slave ownership against the abolitionists of the North. So let's reread that. It says that the Mazzini-Rothschild conspiracy. So for one, Giuseppe Mazzini, who was an Italian, this gentleman you see on the screen, Giuseppe Mazzini spearheaded a plan in league with the Rothschilds to foment the Civil War along the divide of the volatile issue of race. So the Rothschilds and some of their agents, and one of them was Giuseppe Mazzini, a Mason. The Rothschilds wanted to come up with different ways and strategies to indebt the United States, and also try to indebt some of the American landowners in the South by setting up the central banks, giving out loans, credits, etc. But remember, at this time, the people was already running stuff. They didn't need the Rothschilds. So they used these issues of race. They used the issues of the federal government versus state governments, and all these little differences that the people had. And they created a gumbo pot of BS, really, that eventually spilled over into what we call the American Civil War. So yes, you have these political reasons, but trust me, there are people behind the scenes putting money up and supporting certain causes. And a lot of the times, y'all, it's all about the money at the end of the day. It's all about setting up central banks. It's all about financing militaries, financing governments, financing oligarchies, financing families. So they're indebted to the black nobility. So they're indebted to a lot of these Illuminati members that are financiers. Okay? So it says, the Mazzini-Rothschild conspiracy devolved from Southern Jewish community networked with secret societies of the Skull and Bones, the Knights of the Golden Circle, and the Ku Klux Klan. So when you think about the Ku Klux Klan, yes, you're going to have those poor Caucasian people that are missing teeth, you know, riding on a horse with a torch in their hand and a double-barrel shotgun, wearing a Klan outfit, speaking in a Southern ignorant slang and accent. Yes, you're going to have them sent out there. But the men that sent them out there are high-level bankers and Masons that are wearing suits behind closed doors. And they're part of the government. They politicians, etc. All right. So they just use these lower level poor white trash to do the dirty work, so the community can see them performing the racist acts. But behind closed doors, you have higher level Freemasons, and a lot of these Caucasian Freemasons, excuse me, they work with the Black Boule, and they work with the Prince Hall so-called Black Freemasons to go against the greater black community. Yes, let's keep going. So remember, when you think about the Ku Klux Klan, think about the Skull and Bones, think about the Knights of the Golden Circle. All right. This part is very important right here. The Supreme Council ancient and accepted Scottish Rite Southern jurisdiction, commonly known as the Mother Supreme Council of the World, founded in Charleston in 1801, was headed by Albert Pike, who headed the super rite of Freemasonry known as the Palladian Rite with Mazzini. I'm going to reread that. That's very, very important, because Albert Pike is one of the grand masters of Freemasonry. And when you read the morals and dogmas and the works of Albert Pike, this is what the Ku Klux Klan studies. When you read this, they have in there that they worship Lucifer as their chief god. So the chief god of Freemasonry is Lucifer, okay? Or also known as the Baphomet, or also known in a variety of names, okay? But he uses the word Lucifer, okay? So Albert Pike is a very, very important person to know historically, so you'll understand Freemasonry and you'll understand the Ku Klux Klan. Because remember, the whole ideology that the Ku Klux Klan has, the skinheads and all these neo-Nazi groups, that whole ideology of the Aryan race, even the same ideology as Adolf Hitler, and this whole idea of this great Aryan race that was born by these angelic beings back during the times of Atlantis that had blue eyes and blonde hair, and they're from Agartha, or they're from this inner world, galaxy, the Pleiadians. They're saying that these are the sons of God that went into the daughters of man to produce what's known as the Caucasian race. And when they left the Caucasus Mountains, they went on a great expansion throughout the world and conquered all the great civilizations. They conquered the ancient civilizations of Asia. They conquered the ancient civilizations of the so-called Middle East. They conquered the Byzantine Empire. They conquered Western Europe. They conquered the Americas. This is the mythology. So they left from the Caucasus Mountains, became who we know of as the Khazars, or the Jews, the Greeks, the Romans, and later on the people of Britain and Western Europe and Christianity and Christendom. And this is the whole quote-unquote history or the myth of Western civilization. This is what has been financed and put into the academic system. So that whole idea that its civilization, intellect, and knowledge sprouted out of Greece, and from Greece it went to Rome, and from Rome it went to Great Britain. All of that is part of the same Aryan race myth created by Madame Blavatsky and her contemporaries. Madame Blavatsky, which is the grandmother of the occult for Western civilization, she is one of the chief patrons of Adolf Hitler. So the people that taught Adolf Hitler the Aryan race myth and the whole the Pleiadians and the sons of God, and that the Caucasian people are a chosen race, this is the same ideology that was passed on to the American skinheads, the American Ku Klux Klan, or really the Caucasians over here. Okay, so that's where that whole skinhead Ku Klux Klan ideology comes from, of them thinking that they're the Aryan race, them thinking that they're the descendants of the Spartans, them thinking that they're the descendants of the ancient Vikings. That's another thing. The whole Ku Klux Klan and the whole skinheads in the United States, they try to associate themselves with the Viking mythos of Odin, okay, the Viking mythos of Thor, of Rollo, okay, of Eric the Explorer. All right, not really knowing that all these were so-called black men. You had melanated Vikings and you had Caucasian Vikings who were their servants. So this is the ideology that Mazzini, Albert Pike, and those higher level Illuminati Freemasons, this is the ideology that they taught to the poor white Southerners. They told them that they were this great Aryan race that had blue eyes and blonde hair, and that they are the descendants from the sons of God during the days of Genesis in the Bible. And they are greater than every other race on this earth. They are greater than the so-called Negro. So that's where Adolf Hitler got that from. Remember, the whole Nazi movement and the whole Third Reich during the during World War II, excuse me. Adolf Hitler learned his racist ways from the Caucasians in the United States because it was older and it had been going on for a very long time. So let's reread this sentence. It says the Supreme Council, ancient and accepted Scottish Rite Southern jurisdiction, commonly known as the Mother Supreme Council of the world, founded in Charleston in 1801, was headed by Albert Pike, who headed the super rite of Freemasonry known as the Palladian Rite with Mazzini. All right. So these Ku Klux Klan members in the South that were performing all these terroristic acts, a lot of them were Scottish Rite Freemasons. Okay. Including the ones in Georgia. All right. Let's see if it's anything else. Yep, right here. The Rothschilds' funding of the North was conducted through August Belmont, 1813 to 1890. James Rothschild controlled the South via the agent Judah P. Benjamin, 1811 to 1884, a Southern lawyer and politician who came to be known as the Jewish Confederate. Benjamin was the most prominent Jewish plantation owner, having built Belle Chase Plantation in the Palikmines Parish, and owning 140 slaves. So remember, the Rothschild, they sent agents to the American South and they sent agents to the Union because they had political differences. So you can't tell the people in the South the same thing that you're telling the people in the North in order to start the Civil War. So they sent August Belmont as an agent to the North to deal with the abolitionists, and they sent Judah P. Benjamin as an agent in the South to deal with the racist Dixiecrats. But both had the same agenda of starting the Civil War. And also, this one is going to really kick you when I say this. Hold on. I can't remember the name of the book, but there were several books that I've read where it said that Judah P. Benjamin was a so-called black Jew. Let me say that one more time. This agent right here named Judah P. Benjamin, that was born in 1811 and he died in 1884. He was a Southern lawyer and politician, and he was known as the Jewish Confederate. I've read books before where they talked about this man and his importance of, during this time period. And he was described as a black Jew. Now, a lot of the times they're going to show you Caucasian images of a lot of these Jewish people and a lot of these Europeans. But a lot of them were melanated people. Okay? I know that sounds confusing, but as they say, the truth is stranger than fiction. So the next thing that we're going to do is I'm going to read now some Bowen Homes records. For those of you that may not be familiar with Atlanta, Georgia, or Georgia, Bowen Homes is one of the projects that were in Atlanta, and we're going to read about it so we can get ready to talk about these terroristic acts on the west side. This document is from the Atlanta Housing organization, and it's on Bowen Homes, okay? Historical notes. So we're going to just read about Bowen Homes. Bowen Homes was part of the low-rent housing program located at Yates Drive Northwest and Wilkes Circle. Completed March 10th, 1964, it was located in District 9, had 650 units, and was situated on 53.9 acres of property, bounded by Bankhead Highway on the north and Field Road on the east. Bowen Homes provided homes for approximately 4,000 people displaced primarily from the old Buttermilk Bottoms area and other areas surrounding that of the Atlantic Civic Center. So Bowen Homes, it was created in 1964. People that were relocated from another part of Atlanta, the old Buttermilk Bottoms area, so they can get new housing. Let's continue. Bowen Homes was named for the Bishop J.W.E. Bowen, a well-known religious and civic leader. The streets within the projects were also named for other prominent religious and business leaders, such as Wilkes Circle, Yates Drive, Shiver Street, and Walton Street. Bowen Homes held regular community meetings, had many clubs and organizations throughout the years, including a senior citizens club organized in 1964. A daycare center, keep in mind a daycare center, opened 1965. A small and junior boys softball league, and the Bowen, a girls teen group active in intellectual, social, and religious affairs, which met weekly in the community center. A.D. Williams Elementary School, a blue and white 86,000 square foot school named after Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s grandfather, and the Frederick Douglass High School were the schools which served the children of Bowen homes. Now let me say this real quick. Now, it was created in 1964, all right? The people that moved there, the grandparents that moved there, these were all people that grew up in the segregation era, all right? And they grew up during a time where the melanated American people had to stick together. So this is before it became this projects and this whole gangster street thing that we may know of today. Like if you think of the West Side and Bowen homes today, you know, you may think about T.I., you know what I'm saying? Or rest in peace to the brother Marlo, you may think about him. But the West Side and the inner city of Atlanta, it may be hood and street today, it may be drug infested today, but it was not like that. It was not like that prior to the Dixiecrats and prior to the Illuminati really getting a stronghold on our people in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s with the drugs. All right. So remember, it said that in Bowen homes they had regular community meetings, they had many clubs and organizations, senior citizens clubs, a daycare center. They had softball leagues, girl teen groups, and they were active in intellectual, social, and religious affairs. This is all the stuff that the black community is missing today. If our people had these things, we would be way better. You know what I'm saying? We would be much more together. And it was the people of Bowen homes that were performing these activities and providing the leadership in this. You know what I'm saying? So Bowen homes, it was its own little community. You know, all these families. It said it was what, 4,000 people that moved over there? Let's keep on going. Bowen homes was a diverse community, and many musicians and famous people have come from Bowen homes, including D4L Shawty Low. Rest in peace, Shawty Low. You know, majority of y'all know him. The Shop Boys, MDC, and YDC. Bowen homes also shares its history of tragedy. Now listen up, because this is what this video is about. This is what the video is dedicated to. On October 13th, 1980, 4 preschool children and 1 teacher were killed at the Gate City Bowen Homes Daycare in an alleged gas-fired boiler explosion. At the time of the blast, the daycare was occupied by 8 adults and 82 children. 52-year-old teacher Neil Robinson and 4 3-year-old children Kevin Snelson, Andre Stanford, Ronald Brown, and Terrence Bradley were killed and 7 others injured. Allegations were also made that the explosion had been created by the KKK. A bomb threat was called in to A.D. Williams Elementary School that very same day, just across the street. So now we starting to see how all this ties together. So we just went through how the Ku Klux Klan, the Knights of the Golden Circle, the Palladian Rite, the Scottish Rite Freemasons, Southern Jurisdiction, led by Albert Pike, led by Mazzini and the Rothschild conspiracy, how they came into the South and they were brainwashing these poor white people. A lot of these poor white people were very jealous of the so-called black Americans in the South because we had land, we had houses, and our women were fly. So they started to hate, and they started to commit violence and terrorism on our people to scare and run our people off the land. This is what they did with the Indian Removal Act in 1820 under President Andrew Jackson, the man on the $20 bill. So it says right here we are in 1980 on October 13th that there was a bombing and 4 children died, and we're going to read their names again. Kevin Snelson, rest in power. Andre Stanford, rest in power. Ronald Brown, rest in power. Terrence Bradley, rest in power. They were killed and 7 others were injured, and there was a teacher, Neil Robinson, rest in power, the teacher that died. Alright? And it was an alleged gas-fired boiler explosion. So this was the BS reason that they were giving out. But a lot of the people in the community, if you look at a lot of their archives, they were saying that it was the KKK And you had people in the community saying that they had spotted people in the early wee hours of that morning, spotted Caucasian men running behind the schools, running behind the daycare, potentially setting things up. But in other words, Caucasian men were seen early that morning before this happened, lurking in the area. All right. And it also says that a bomb threat was called in to A.D. Williams Elementary School that very same day. Let's continue. Reverend Joseph Lowry, head of the SCLC, asserted, quote, "There is an organized assault on the black people across the country. We are tired of our children being killed," end quote. Many refused to accept the explosion at the daycare center had resulted from a faulty boiler, and a claim some people believed orchestrated to pacify a city on the edge of a turbulent period of racial violence. That the explosion came following just 24 hours after J.B. Stoner held a conference of international white supremacists in the neighboring county, and that Stoner had a reputation for bombing black targets since the 1950s, heightened the belief that the explosion on the Gate City Bowen Homes daycare was no accident. Let's reread this. So Reverend Joseph Lowry said that there is an organized assault on the black people across the country. And it said that many of the black people of the Bowen Homes community, many refused to accept the explosion at the daycare center had resulted from a faulty boiler. No. A claim some people believe orchestrated to pacify a city on the edge of a turbulent period of racial violence. So it was already a lot of racial violence going on in the 1980s. So the people didn't go for that BS. When they came out and told them during the press conferences that this resulted from an explosion, they didn't believe that. Okay. Then let's go on. It says that the explosion came following 24 hours after J.B. Stoner held a conference of international white supremacists in the neighboring county, and that Stoner had a reputation for bombing black targets since the late 1950s. So that means that 24 hours after J.B. Stoner, which is probably a white racist, was out there, spewing his hatred, 24 hours later they bombed something on the west side. So that's what happened, y'all. All these bombings, bringing in drugs. This is what started to mess your community up. That's why you don't have the community meetings no more. That's why you don't have the senior citizen clubs no more. That's why we don't have the junior boys softball leagues no more. Because you had a lot of people conspiring against you. And then let's end it. It says, in addition to being a target of racial violence, Bowen Homes, one of the largest public housing communities in Atlanta, also became notorious as a target area for drugs and crime. Bowen Homes was demolished in 2009. So Bowen Homes was not always an area for drugs and crime. It was targeted. It was a targeted area for drugs and crime. So that means this. If the so-called black people of the Bowen Homes community, if they didn't bring the heroin in, if they didn't bring the crack cocaine in, then who brought it in? Yes, they did sell it. Yes, they did use it. I'm not saying that that's right. But who brought it in? The same MF who brought in them damn bombs that blew up the daycares, the people who saying that's bringing the drugs in and all that. So yeah, y'all don't come at my little brother Rollo too quick. You know what I'm saying? Because like I told you all on prior videos, this stuff was brought into the community to prey on our people who are already in an impoverished situation. So now we're going to look at a video by one of the elders that's dealing with the Bowen Homes daycare explosion.
As evening came to Bowen Homes, so did hundreds of the curious, their cars crowding the streets to try to get a glimpse of what was left of the daycare center. Meanwhile, at a downtown news conference, Police Commissioner Lee Brown told the city that the experts have found no evidence of foul play, no signs of an intentional bombing. He says all they know is the furnace blew up. They're still not quite sure why. And when City Councilman Arthur Langford started what was supposed to be a memorial service and an informational meeting at a church near the blast site, most seemed ready to listen to Commissioner Brown and his evidence. But in no time it was obvious that many doubted his explanation, and they weren't quiet about their opinions.
That's right. I want to go out there and find out why it happened and what it happened with it and who did it. That's what I want to find out. Who did it? Because there's no one involved.
In short order, the meeting became a madhouse, a shouting match with the media as chief spectators. And shortly after that, they asked all the reporters to leave.
Ain't gonna let nobody.
Then activist Hosea Williams and a big part of the crowd came out. They started a march towards City Hall. And while Hosea's group was waiting before they jumped to conclusions, they too doubt what the police say.
Why are you marching? Why?
To try to force them to bring out the truth of what is happening to black people in this city and in this nation. That's why we are marching. We're tired of rhetoric, we're tired of talk and misleading and empty promises.
And while some preached to doubt, Dr. Joseph Lowry tried to inspire people to wait until all the facts come out before they jump to conclusions.
The people are very reluctant to accept a simplistic answer to a very difficult question. And we urge them to be patient and to depend on Commissioner Brown to get to the bottom of it.
But as Lowry left the church, one young man refused to shake his hand, a move that may be characteristic of the split in the city right now. Gary Reeves, Action News Tonight.
You're pimping black folk and y'all won't leave. That's just my attitude, and so as a man, I don't want to shake your hand.
So as you can see, a lot of our people weren't going for it, man. You know, they just weren't going for it. So you have these domestic terrorist attacks happening in Atlanta, Georgia. Another situation I want you to think about is the Atlanta child murders. Now, let's read. It says the Atlanta murders of 1979 and 1981, sometimes called the Atlanta child murders, are a series of murders committed in Atlanta, Georgia between July 1979 and May 1981. Over the 2-year period, at least 28 African American children, adolescents, and adults were killed. Wayne Williams, an Atlanta native who was 23 years old at the time of the last murder, was arrested, tried, and convicted of 2 of the adult murders and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. So they're saying that the Atlanta child murders was all done by Wayne Williams, one man. You know, I personally, of course, do not believe that. But this is what I want you to think about real quick. Was Wayne Williams alone? Was Wayne Williams a patsy or a fall guy? Was Wayne Williams a CIA operative? Was the Ku Klux Klan involved? Let's check out this video.
Good morning, how you doing?
When we returned to prison for our final interview with Wayne Williams, we had one question he was not expecting. What Wayne had written about being recruited for espionage training as a teenager. At a secret government camp hidden in the woods near this North Georgia lake, where he was given what could amount to a license to kill.
Now remember, CNN, when they put this out, they titled this Alleged Atlanta Child Murderer. They still saying alleged after he was quote-unquote apparently convicted. So even after this man was convicted and put in prison, it still was not collectively really accepted that this one man committed all these murders by himself.
It's called Finding Myself. What's Finding Myself? It reads like an autobiography.
Go ahead, I'm still trying to...
It's a account of your CIA training.
We're not going to get into that.
Why not?
We're not going to get into that.
I got a copy of it.
Yeah, but we're not going to get into that.
Why not?
You're just simply not going to get into that.
So notice how comfortable Wayne Williams is. Look at his body language. Look at his tone, how it changes. Look at his facial expressions. He got very uncomfortable when she brought up the fact that when he was 19 years old, he apparently had written down in some of his notes some of his history with the CIA and some training. Why was Wayne Williams being trained by the CIA at 19 years old?
By his account, Wayne Williams was fresh out of high school, just 18 years old, when he was initiated into a secret world. So, I'll do the talking part and you can...
Now notice the word she used. She said when he was initiated into a secret world. Initiated. Was Wayne Williams a Freemason? Just asking.
Didn't answer what part of it you want. You write how you fired rifles, submachine guns, handled assault weapons, grenade launchers, C4, learned unarmed combat techniques through this training group over weekends. Is it?
I'm going to tell you all just from my experience. My uncle was an Army Ranger, and he was in the Ranger Regiment. Multiple family members Vietnam. I'm very familiar with military training. Everything that she just described Wayne Williams was trained in, that's Special Forces Green Beret type training. Okay? So that's very high level training. So let's keep going.
True or is it false?
We're not going to comment on
When
it.
you're 19 years old. You're saying you work for the CIA. You've been recruited.
I'll let the document speak for itself.
What was the CIA recruiting him for? He said, let the document speak for himself. What did the CIA want with him? What did the CIA see in him? If you look deeper into Wayne Williams' situation, apparently during the time he was promoting himself to be involved with, I think, music, and was soliciting, or really he was putting out ads for young people that were into music, that maybe he could help them start a music career or something like that, to attract some of these young people in the impoverished communities throughout Atlanta. He also talked about his distaste for poor black people as well, I can remember, in some of his notes.
Not going to comment on it.
Copyright 1992 by Wayne Williams. Is this an autobiography?
I cannot comment on that.
Were you trained in unarmed combat techniques? Could you grab somebody bigger than yourself, put them in a chokehold? Because that's what that is.
I'm sure there are other things in unarmed combat besides putting somebody in a chokehold.
Well, when I talk to the military experts and I say to them, what exactly does that mean? That's one of the things on their list. Top 2 things, by the way.
I wouldn't doubt that.
So, are you trained in that or not?
Let me say this. Let's just say that I had some experiences that I do not want to comment on today for reasons that the document says, okay? The fact is, what does that have to do with the situation today?
Mr. Williams, it has everything to do with it. You graduated high school at 18 years old. You were recruited by the CIA immediately. And at 19, you were being trained in the woods of the South in Special Forces Green Beret Delta operative tactics. What were you being trained for? And then, this is at 19, right? And then 3 or 4 years later, you're caught. You're caught and being blamed for killing 20 plus children in different parts of Atlanta at different times. It matters, my guy. It matters.
Everything.
You tell me.
It has everything to do with it. A big part of the conversation when I talked to your lawyers was, could Wayne Williams grab somebody? Did he have the strength? Look how, he's not a big guy.
Thing is that Wayne Williams, could he have grabbed somebody? Yes. Could Wayne Williams have possibly done some of this? Yes. But was Wayne Williams alone? Was Wayne Williams part of a greater network? Was there organ harvesting going on?
Could he grab someone in a unarmed combat technique and kill them? It's actually a very simple question. Can you kill someone with a chokehold? And when you were 19 years old,
you probably could. Under the
I know for a fact I could not. I know you're being facetious, but I know for a fact I could not.
You don't know.
But were you trained as a teenager to do that? Because that's what you're writing in this. And I get CIA. You don't want to talk about it. It's all off the record.
Let me state this for the record. Okay. I think in the paper that you have, and I will say this, that it says that there was contact with a certain program, and I will say it was the Junior Officer Training Program, which was run by a certain agency, and you're correct, CIA. But I never said that I worked for them. I simply said
that was splitting hairs.
that I had.
Also, let me tell y'all this too. In a lot of these racist organizations, skinheads, various Ku Klux Klan factions throughout the United States of America, a lot of them do have retired military. A lot of them do have retired Green Berets, Rangers, possibly even Delta Force operatives that teach them how to create bombs and other things that they've learned through military training.
Were you trained?
Some contact
Were you
with some
trained?
person, and that's all I'm going to say.
Were you trained
That's all I'm
in
going
these
to say.
techniques?
That's all I'm going to say.
What does the coffee you drink every day?
So we can see Mr. Wayne Williams didn't want to talk about it, but that's the video. So you all hit me up in the comment section. Tell me what it is you think. You know, what you've learned about this domestic terrorist situation. Think about, you know, the bombings in Bowen homes, you know, and all the other bombings. But salute. I hope you all gain much from this. Stay tuned for the next one. We out.